with Stanley Black & Decker, where we focus on companies making advances in manufacturing. And specifically, I was focused on additive manufacturing in my first year and sustainable packaging tech and advanced manufacturing in second year. That's where I met Sai on a panel that we were on about additive manufacturing. But I got to this place in my career and my work because many, many years ago, I started my own company after taking a break from the workforce to stay home with my kids, and went on to raise capital. The business was acquired, and I went on to run digital services and an innovation team for a multi-billion-dollar company up here in Boston. So I'm pretty passionate about the idea of entrepreneurship as a way forward for women, but really for everyone who's looking to make a change. So as a level set, I don't know if you guys remember this. You're nodding, right? This was a big work from home moment that was novel just a few years ago in 2017, the idea that there was like a little kid running into a work meeting. And of course, in the world of COVID, this is our new norm. And another conversation and dialogue, I would say, that's been happening over the last few years is on the concept of leaning in. And this is particularly something that's been focused on women in leadership and at work. But for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Sheryl Sandberg wrote a book in 2013 called Lean In, which was really designed to be a manifesto to encourage women to embrace their careers, embrace leadership, double down on your careers in the workforce. And then I was actually featured on the Lean In website as an example of someone taking risks, right? And then in the last few years, there's been a counter, like backlash to that. And you've seen there's been a number of articles coming out on why leaning in doesn't work, how, women should not be forced or be recommended to lean into their careers. And this actually has really caused me to think that this is actually just a false dichotomy that's happening out there. This is not a real debate. What we're really talking about is what is the world of work we want to be in. So I actually wrote an article recently that was picked up by Fast Company, where I'm trying to get across the point that I think instead of asking whether people should be doubling down on their careers or stepping out of the workforce or what's right or what's wrong, we should be really taking a holistic look at what is the world of work and how can we change that and make it better for everyone. So in the startup community, we talk a lot about the idea of, hey, it's two guys in a garage have started all the big companies you can think of that are out there right now, ranging from Amazon to Apple. And now, especially in the time of COVID, I'd ask, why not the living room? And historically, people have not talked about starting businesses in the home. It's always just at the man cave portion of the home, in part because of this. In the past, up until COVID, and I think this is one of the few shining positive things about COVID, and I think even today I saw someone who has a little kid on a call, we're sudden that this thing that we used to compartmentalize all the time and was huge news that it even happened is now just part of the normal. And I think this is actually a wonderful opportunity for entrepreneurs, for workers, for families to reconsider why things are the way they are and drive some real change. So just to quickly, take a step back into how did we get to this point where the world of work and the world of home has been so compartmentalized and we make these choices that are so challenging? That'd be helpful to take a quick look at some of the people that we're used to seeing in the news today. This is, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Elizabeth Warren, Hillary Clinton, when they were in their 20s in the 1970s. And in 1974, it's important to realize that women could not get credit without a male cosigner. So that meant women were essentially, by our own societal constructs, were not trusted with money. So if you wanted to get credit for your home or for a business, you needed to bring a guy with you in order to get that. And I think it's interesting to think about the challenges that these leaders that we see in our everyday lives today, realizing this wasn't that long ago, and that's embedded in some of the work that we do and how we engage with each other. Until 1978, women could not be unafraid of being discriminated against for pregnancy or possible pregnancy. It seems unheard of today, but this wasn't that long ago. And of course, we all know that many of our current leaders had grandmothers who were not allowed to even vote. And, sometimes it's easy to just say, hey, all of this has changed. All of this is over and done. We've passed legislation. Everything's okay. But the reality is that a lot of these things are still deeply conditioned in how we interact. And it also, in fact, impacts how women think about raising capital, how we think about stepping up in leadership. And this might also be why, if we look at the stats right now, we still only have 7.4% of Fortune 500 CEOs who are women. And by the way, this was a huge headline this year because last year it was 5%. And if you saw any of the headlines, it was like, huge increase for women. And I'm like, it's still only 7%. So women also only hold 20% of corporate board seats, which again, massive increase, from previous years. So we're trending in the right direction, but we're doing so at a rate that doesn't get us to equity anytime soon. And I think though, one of the things, and, Sai mentioned that I have a podcast, which is called The 43%. And it's focused on storytelling, on the idea of getting more stories out of women on their career journeys, navigating family and career. And I think because we have children in staggered stages, it's sometimes people don't recognize that 85% of women become mothers at some point in their career paths. So the point at which it's most challenging, obviously, is often when your kids are little, and it's easy to move on from there and forget how challenging it was. But the reality is that this is an opportunity for us to think about, especially now in the world of COVID, what all of this looks like. So knowing that, we have so many few women and women who are mothers in leadership, you can start to see why, only 17% of US companies formally offer true paid maternity leave, why childcare isn't something easily accessible for everyone before school starts. And as we're all seeing right now with COVID in particular, the workday and the school day don't line up. If you think about a normal workday being 9 to 5, a normal school day being 8 to 3, there's huge challenges on both sides of that for anyone trying to balance these things. And on top of all of this, I won't stay on this topic too long, but the reality is that when jobs are done by men, they still pay more. The first programmers were actually women in the 1940s. In World War II, as women were out in the workforce because of the war, they were actually doing some of the first programming in the primitive form of what we now think of. But it wasn't until, but it was not well paid. It was considered something that was good for women to do, was actually some language that was used because it was required the same skills that one would need for knitting. It was described in that way. And of course, it was when men stepped into the field that it started to become a lucrative, respected position. And now we're trying to get women back into STEM. The first people to deliver babies were women, but it wasn't until it became a field that it became, more highly paid. So just going into this idea of the psychology of how we interact with each other and where these images come from, if you go on Google and you search just simply for CEO, not male CEO, not white male CEO, this is what the algorithm spits up for you, because that's what it's been trained to uncover. And, if you search for doctor, it's a little more varied because there's more women who have entered the profession. But one of the things I try to highlight is that a lot of making steps forward is being able to see yourself in certain positions. So I don't know if you're familiar with the picture I have up here right now, but this is like a TV show from the late 90s called Ally McBeal. And I put it up here because was a silly show about lawyers in Boston. And it was just, all these people were partners. But there was a direct correlation between an increase in law school applicants by women during the time that shows like this started to achieve, popularity. So this idea that even if it's not something serious, just simply seeing yourself in a role makes you more inclined subconsciously to think about pursuing it. So one of the things that we need to consider when we look at the stats on venture capital in particular and entrepreneurship, Right now in 2019, less than 3% of venture capital went to female founders. And that's across the board. And there's been studies out there, and some of the things actually at Techstars, we're making conscious steps to undo some of these things. But there are studies out there that women get different questions from investors than men. And what that looks like in real time is studies have shown that women will get questions focused on the risk associated with the business that they're working on. You know, what could go wrong? Who are your competitors? What's the problem? Whereas men are more likely to get questions about the size and scale of the opportunity. And so this, of course, makes men more likely to get investment because they're answering the question about how big this is going to be. So one of the things that we coach women on is actually taking those questions and making sure, you know, you understand you have an opportunity to flip your answer, you know, acknowledge risk and move right to opportunity. But why does this even happen, right? No one consciously wants to do this to people. No one's consciously trying to undermine women in these conversations. It happens because, in part, women have been conditioned to get it right. There are studies out there that going back to early childhood, girls are more likely to be rewarded for compliant behavior. That means, did you show up on time? Did you stay in your seat? Did you do a good job? They get a lot of positive feedback for those behaviors. Boys actually get ignored for those behaviors. They just don't get any, they're likely to get no attention at all, but they get a ton of attention for misbehavior. And so the studies indicate that that leads us to look, you know, you end up pursuing and doing things where you can get the most feedback. And if, you know, so even if it's negative feedback, you'll do it more than no feedback. So boys are more conditioned to not be afraid of taking a risk. What's the worst that happens, right? Girls are very conditioned to be compliant, to get it right, to get the right answer. So these are some of the things that we're trying to help folks unpack as we move forward. And so one of the things I'm trying to encourage folks, and why I wrote the book, why I'm doing the podcast, some of the things I'm doing at Techstars, is I think there's a way to lean in by starting up. And this applies to men and women. But when we think about startups, we think about the potential that startups have and what they've brought us. You know, if you look around, you know, it's everything from the tools we're using today to Uber, which it's harder to use right now, right? But our online tax solutions, for those of you who did your taxes this week, and, you know, everything out there. But they've also normalized a lot of workplace activities that we kind of take for granted, even in big corporations now. Like when I was starting out in my career, it was still like a big deal to wear jeans on Friday. Like that was, you know, the casual element. Startups really normalized casual dress, being able to work remotely, being able to bring your dog to work, having collaborative workspaces. And yet the big elephant in the room that I think finally we're starting to unpack with COVID is talking about family and work, and where does that fit in and how does that come together? And so when we go back to that Fortune 500 that has very limited representation and leadership right now for women, thinking about the fact that we know from studies that companies with diversity and leadership do better. We know that 40% of the startups, the Fortune 500 companies that are here today are not going to be here in, you know, the future. They're going to be displaced. There's actually no better time to start up, to not just starting up for yourself, for your own livelihood, but to thinking about how to start up so that you can scale, so that you can build solutions. You're going to build the next Uber, you're going to build the next Zoom, whatever it is. But you can, while you're building that, you have the potential to change the world of work in the process. So that's why I wrote a book on this. That's why I work for Techstars, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Claudia, I want to have you talk a little bit about Lessonly. We were talking about the fact that you're on the board there, and we had an opportunity to have Max Schroeder speak in Columbus more than once. He spoke at our Next Gen Leadership Lunch a couple of years ago. He's incredibly dynamic and smart, and I just wondered about how you got to know them. And I mentioned also that the chamber is a client, and that we use the tool the learning management system for our own high school entrepreneurship program. So will you just talk a little bit about Lessonly?
Sure, Lessonly is amazing. So I'm privileged to be able to work with the folks at Lessonly. So the company that I started was a company focused on software for in the education sector. We were doing SaaS solutions for accreditation and assessment. We were acquired by a company called Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, which is up here in Boston, which is why I'm in Boston. And HMH, as it's easier to say, so basically provides curriculum solutions across all of the United States and around the world. There's also a publishing division and multiple resources for professionals. But so I was working as the Senior Vice President for Innovation and Digital Services for HMH. Around the same time, Lessonly was looking for an independent board director. And they were looking for someone who could come in, who had founder experience, who understood the LMS space, which is where Lessonly works and fits, except in the corporate space. And so started interviewing with them to have an opportunity to join their board, which has been a great experience. They are a phenomenal company in Indiana, and they are having rapid growth because of great product and great leadership by Max and Connor and team. They essentially are creating online solutions that, in particular, I'm echoing somewhere.
Yeah, you are.
They provide online solutions that allow people to essentially, as Max would say, do better work, and they hone in on the customer care teams and on sales enablement, but they can really support an organization at scale. And they've gone from, early days of supporting smaller businesses to now they have moved into, name a company and I'm sure they're engaged with them in some way. Just they're a phenomenal team, and they've had, significant growth in the last few years, and they just raised a C round actually. So they're continuing to expand.
One of our great Indiana stories so far, I think.
Yeah, they're amazing.
Can you talk a little bit about the next cohorts that are coming out for Techstars and how everything going on right now is going to change? Or are you guys going to a hybrid model, or are you still doing it in person? What's that like?
It has been fluid, I would say, is a good word to use. We actually have a COVID working group. We have a meeting today actually at 10. So we run, because we have about 50 accelerators and growing, we run accelerators year round on 6 terms. So we have, a January, a March, so we call them internally, this is our internal words, but we'll line up and say, okay, these are all the programs running in term 1, term 2, term 3. So our term 1 programs all started in person. That was Boston, the U.S. Air Force program. They were running in program when COVID started. And so we had to actually quickly operationalize to help everyone flip to virtual, make sure everyone was safe. Because when you join Techstars, you actually typically go to the city that the Techstars Accelerator is in, and you live there for 13 weeks. So we have people coming from around the world to stay in our programs. And so that was what was exciting. Was it was incredibly challenging, and yet it was seamless. We flipped 16 programs and they all, kept going. Those companies are continuing to have success. Everything's okay. And that's in part because for many years now, we've had a virtual program called the Anywhere program, which is based out in San Diego. So that managing director, Ryan, is amazing. And he was quick to share with everyone, these are the best practices. This is how we can do virtual engagement. This is how we make it happen. These are some of the tricks that we have that make this work. So at this point, those programs obviously were 100% virtual. Now each term coming up, it's varying. So our summer programs right now, New York City is running, Los Angeles is running. They're running virtual. But they're leaving the door open to hope for some in-person activities, depending on when things open up. Our term 5 programs, it's depending on the region. And actually I should clarify, even term 4, Tel Aviv is running in person. So it just depends on where people are in the world and what's going on, and what our partners are comfortable with too. Each partner has a different, threshold for what they're willing to do. So our next batch, so to speak, coming up will start in September. And right now it's one by one, like basically each program we're looking at on a case-by-case basis. So we have a program in Montreal that focuses on artificial intelligence in September. We have one with Comcast focused on media entertainment in Philadelphia. We've got MetLife, which is typically in North Carolina, though their headquarters are in New York. And so each one we're just figuring it out on a case by case, but it's definitely it's leaning towards hybrid for most of them. So I think, like, I know, for example, with Montreal, what they're going to do is assume there's a base level of virtual, like just plan for all activities to be virtual. And then they're creating bespoke in-person activities as they can. And even that program manager might fly to Europe to meet with some of the, it might become like, we go to some of the startups too, if they can't come to us. So it's all over the place, but under control.
Yeah. That's more than most then, I would say.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I mean, and it's been interesting to see we've seen the same deal flow. We've seen, actually one of the things too with Techstars, we have an equity back guarantee. So when you come into Techstars, the investment is in exchange for 6% common stock, but it's with an equity back guarantee. So if you get to the end of the program and you're like, this didn't work for me, there's actually a way to get your equity back. And so that's one of the metrics we look at to understand our programs performing. And we haven't had any equity back guarantees to speak of in the last few months. So I think we're doing okay. Yeah.
That's awesome. Has anybody ever taken you up on that?
Generally,
before all this, yeah.
Yeah, it's like a very, very, very small percentage. I think they've kept a doc over 13 years. But the philosophy, and it comes from our founder, David Brown and David Cohen are the co-founders of Techstars. And there's a big value system at Techstars on assuming good intent, giving first, really, assuming the best in people. And there's a big philosophy that, look, we're here to deliver value. And if we're not, or if someone's going to be a bad actor and doesn't, is going to try to take advantage of that, like, we'd rather know sooner than later anyway, and so, we looked for the best, and I think the best usually comes back. So that's part of the core value system at Techstars.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Any thought about having a COVID specific cohort?
There is some talk, not necessarily of a COVID specific cohort, but there are some talks going on about things like supply chain resiliency, like things that are side effects of it. We have a partner right now that we're starting to talk to about some additional programming related to COVID. And we actually did a startup week. So we also run startup weeks, like community events around the world. And we did a startup week focused on COVID, and we put out a whole bunch of resources. And actually Scott Dorsey, who's on the board over at Leslie, a big member of your community, did a resource webinar with Brad Feld and some other leaders on getting through this based on their experience. So there's been a whole series of webinars and resources that we've been trying to put out to support the founders. And then we're now getting under the hood with a lot of our corporations and how we can help them. So we've seen so many. I mean, it was interesting. Sai, about additive manufacturing. It was really interesting to see, 2018, we did this program focused on AM, and we, 3D printing, for those of you familiar or unfamiliar with it. And, there's a lot of conversation still on, is this just something for consumer hobbyists and whatnot? And we know that it's not. We know this has the potential to be something really disruptive in general manufacturing. But I think COVID has really shined a light on that. And suddenly people were calling up companies that went through our program, like, can you 3D print ventilator parts? Can you 3D print masks for us? And I think it really drew a lot of attention to AM and the potential that it has in supply chain resiliency in the future too. So it's interesting.
Absolutely. I don't want to monopolize the questions. Who else has some questions?
It's early.
I wondered if one of the folks from Conversite could speak to how it's impacted, COVID has impacted their business for better or for worse. Ganesh or Charlie could share some of the experiences.
Go ahead, Ganesh.
No, you are first. I know you are ready.
Well, it's been a wild ride. I mean, I vividly remember the week of March 9th. We were in the middle of fundraising, if you can imagine that. So Monday, we presented to a group in Tennessee, and the room was full, and almost everybody wanted to invest. 2 days later, we were in Chicago. 20% of the people showed up in person. Some showed up virtually. Nobody wanted to do too much. We had another meeting Friday, the 13th, and it just got canceled. So just literally in that 1 week period, we went from great momentum to no momentum. But then as the COVID thing started to unfold, all of a sudden our product, since it serves the supply chain, became more attractive. And so our sales, we had actually our best sales month ever in May. And so then the investors started to come back, and fortunately Elevate Ventures stepped up and became our lead investor, and we closed our round in June for 50% more than we were talking about in March. So it's been an interesting ride. Ganesh can speak to probably more of the specifics, but it was amazing to watch that roller coaster, and it just went from zero to then fast.
Yeah, it's like everyone just froze.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think most investors really were trying to make sure their own companies were okay before they looked at other things. That was their first, and I think the right move was make sure all their portfolio companies were doing okay before they listened to much else. And then as it settled in, they started to think, well, the COVID is providing some opportunities for some of these startups. It's more valuable, some of what we're doing. It's particularly with the whole remote working, a lot of these solutions now, the sales cycle has sped up significantly.
Great.
Yeah, Ganesh?
No, I think you covered from the financial side, from a product development side as well. I think remote is not as bad as what we thought. We actually decided we'll stay remote for the rest of the year. It's actually working very well. It saved a lot of time in terms of the travel. I think we have Zoom and all kind of technology to stay connected. And the product team is much more protective now. I think in the last 2 months, the amount of new functionality we have delivered, onboarded several customers is pretty good. So I'm pleased with I would say, like, from outside, like it's hard to go without, like, not meeting customer in person and doing some of those happy hours and building relationship. That's really a pain, but it's not that bad. We can survive.
Yeah, we've been having, like, I know a lot of the managing directors at Techstars have been doing like virtual cocktail hours or virtual coffees. And I mean, it's not the same, but I've also heard a lot of people are talking about the fact that, the fact that people don't have to commute is actually increasing productivity and engagement in some ways, which is interesting. So do you think folks are going to go back to full engagement in offices? And like, we're hearing up here in Boston that a lot of people are considering, or companies are considering, instead of having it be maybe someone works 1 day a week at home and goes into the office for 4 days, flipping that and saying, maybe we don't need all this office space.
Yeah.
And people will get together, for meetings once a week, for what's really critical, and the rest of the time will be at home.
That's what we are thinking. It'll be probably one day a week you come and, collaborate and figure out who's going to do what, then just all in. Yeah.
Yeah. I was talking to one person from pretty large corporation in this area, and they were thinking that 65% would not go back, that they would find ways to do things remotely.
So at the college, we were in a really unique situation, Claudia. We started a brand new building project right before COVID started. And, you know, traditionally a community college is all hands on deck. And of course, we went remote almost immediately when COVID hit, and we're still in remote. But what's really been interesting through this is we are talking about our new normal, giving our employees that more life balance and being able to stay at home. And part of our building, we've actually changed the design to focus more on allowing more of our individuals to work from home at least 1 or 2 days a week, because we found they've been really productive, which has been great to learn. And also going back to your coffee kind of chats, we do a regular coffee with Combs is what I call it. And it's just a way to update everybody and have them all together. But the turnout for that is always better than it ever has been when we had it on campus.
Oh,
and
interesting.
and they've asked to continue that even if we go back into a new normal, so that more people at some of our offsites and other places can participate. So I think that's our new normal going forward.
Yeah.
Interesting. And do you think you're seeing engagement? Because it's just like I've heard from people, it's like, hey, it's easier to just grab a coffee with someone virtually on Zoom than, you know, get dressed and get in the car or go out, you know. Do you think it's just cutting down the commute time, or?
I think it's that, and I also think it gets to those different styles, introverts, extroverts, and just being in their own space. I think they're comfortable, and you know they can do this, right? They can turn off the camera for a second while they're and just kind of be hidden in the background for a little bit, and that's great as long as they're hearing what we're saying. That's a great place for us to be.
Interesting.
So I have a question, maybe related. So now there are a lot of startup activities, you know, for example, when we are in Indianapolis or Minneapolis, so there are a lot of events where we can go meet, socialize with all the startup guys, right? How that will impact, in your view, especially for the first time entrepreneurs or somebody who's fresh, you know, it's basically you feel confident when you see a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of support is there. So how that's going to come in this new norm? What's your feel, Claudia?
You mean like, I don't know if I totally understand your question. Do you mean like how are entrepreneurs, like, are they going to be less likely to succeed?
So for example, like let's take all our Techstars presentations, like the demo days, right? The demo days happen just two things. One is brings that entire network of like 300, 400 people, and a lot of people get impressed. Somebody even newly thinking, oh, I can launch a company, like kind of that, right? That comes. Can we get that same momentum through these virtual meets? So how do we continue to encourage the young kids to come to this entrepreneurship world with this virtual?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think we're still in the relatively early days of understanding how this is all going to play out. But from a Techstars perspective, you know, there's a couple things going on. Like we have our programs called Startup Week, which is really designed for the types of folks you're talking about, people who are just starting to think about entrepreneurship, interested in meeting and networking with other entrepreneurs. And so in a normal pre-COVID world, what that looks like is community-driven events where people come together and we have sessions and panels and ways for people to engage with each other and even, you know, work on pitches in real time. We've flipped a lot of that to virtual experiences. And I just actually participated in one that was originally supposed to be in Connecticut, and we did it virtual. It was on a Saturday. We had a ton of startups on this, and I was serving as a mentor judge over a weekend. And I thought in some ways it was more like the way to, you know, the opportunity was more concise. And so and people were engaging. We were on a Zoom call, but we set up like the breakout rooms. And there's another tool we've been using called Icebreakers, which it just basically, it's kind of silly. Like it has music playing and you just click a button and basically you get, pushed into a meeting room privately with someone you don't know who's also in the same meeting. And it's you can set it on a timer. So you're only, it's just sort of like if you were bumping into someone at a cocktail party, you might only talk to them for 2 or 3 minutes before you move on. It's the same idea. So is it as good as in person? No, in many ways, but it's also working. I mean, and even at Techstars, we used it internally. We have people all over the world, obviously, at Techstars. And we did, usually we have an event every year called StaffCon, where we all get together, and it's like the one time because we're totally distributed. And this year we couldn't do that. So we did this virtual programming. And I met so many people I didn't even know in the company, like people from China and in, all these different places. And we were just using tools like that. And again, it's a new world, right? But it was encouraging. Like I felt like it was working and to a certain degree. And I'm getting meetings with people I don't think I would necessarily would have always had an easy time getting meetings with because of Zoom is what I'm noticing. And I would say from a mentor perspective inside of Techstars, if if for those not familiar, like the first month of Techstars, we bring in like 100 mentors to meet with founders and speed date. And now we're doing that on Zoom or whatever tool the MD's using. It's actually allowing us to bring in folks who maybe wouldn't have been able to come in person because they weren't local. So in some ways we're getting to bring in maybe some even more high caliber people like to different programs depending on where they're located. So TBD, but trending positive.
Yep.
Love it. It is fostering some creativity just out of this strange new world we're in.
If I can ask one more,
Sure.
a small city place like Columbus now, how we have all the interest and support. So how do we bring the the fresh men from colleges and the young ones into the entrepreneurship world? What activities you see other smaller cities are doing, which we could do?
I mean, from a Techstars perspective or just generally? I mean, from a Techstars what's up?
In general.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's everyone around the world is innovating on this right now to figure it out. One of the orgs that I thought did something really interesting recently was, I don't know if you're familiar with the Collision Conference, that it's usually in Toronto and it's a Dublin-based company that does Web Summit. They created a new platform for events to handle, because they have 30,000 people show up to this event, which is designed for startups and big corporations. And they did a really interesting job creating an app and creating these some experiences were simulated. So it appeared to be live, but it actually had been pre-recorded, but the interaction still felt live, like you were engaged with other people. So there's some interesting tools out there. I'm happy to try to share them with you. In terms of what you can specifically do, I mean, I think it's not too different than what you do in a normal world, except trying to figure out how to make it happen virtually.
Sure.
Hi, Claudia. I have a question for you.
Sure.
Who is that?
This is Kylie.
Okay, Kylie.
So in Sinai's region, our Velocities region of Bloomington and Columbus, I feel like there's a lot of diversity in different types of women that could potentially be in our startup ecosystem. We have students, in Bloomington and a lot of female engineers and women in manufacturing in Columbus. And then, there's working moms and working women and women of all ages might be joining our ecosystem. How do we support and engage all these different types of women?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, and this is me now just speaking from personal experience as well, but I definitely think that like anything else, people are at different, parts of their career journey and different stages of what's going on with them personally, right? And making people feel included. There's been, so if someone is, let's say, in a caregiving situation, man or woman, right? Because their kids are little, thinking about when we schedule events, if you want to really get a high turnout of potential entrepreneurs who might also have caregiving responsibilities, and certainly in the early stages of a company when they may not have enough funding to really have an easy time with paying for caregiving services on off hours, you know, maybe not running like an 8 a.m. meeting like this is way better for a lot of people, like a breakfast, than a 7 o'clock at night, you know, witching hour when people are trying to get the kids to bed kind of meeting. And so just realizing, I think that people are at different home responsibilities, and thinking about where you can make things more inclusive. There's a group actually that was doing some research on this. The founder was one of the early employees at Twitter, and they actually put together like a resource group internally to figure out some of the challenges that were leading to less inclusivity for some of the women and men there. And one of the things they saw was, hey, you know, if you have a lot of people who have families in your business, try not to do a core meeting at, say, 3 o'clock, when there might also be a pickup demand or something going on. And so, and oftentimes what people will do is say, oh, it's okay, you don't need to come to the meeting. We'll share notes with you. And so you think you're being nice, or you think you're being accommodating by not requiring someone to come to the meeting, but you're actually limiting their ability to feel like they're contributing as a leader. So just little things like that, thinking about time and logistics, if that's the type of folks engaged. You know, I think as women, we all have to, you know, there's an opportunity for, like, when I brought up the idea of the false dichotomy of lean in or lean out, I really do think it's a false dichotomy, and it's a trap to get into the conversation of should you do one or the other, when we really could be talking about how we're all interacting and how we're all working. Just
Other questions? Claudia, I loved your message, and you really prompted, you know, bells were going off as you talked about some of that early history about not trusting women with money, and it all makes sense when you put that together. And I'm old enough to kind of remember that era. So thank you for bringing that forward, and for the book, and for that important work. And the support you're giving Indiana company, Lessonly, but also all these other startups that you're a part of through Techstars. You're just really making a difference, and I so appreciate hearing from you today and learning more about all the ways you're doing this work.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and Sai, thank you for inviting me here. I love connecting with people, and I'm bummed that I haven't been to Indy lately because of COVID. So hopefully our next meeting will not be on Zoom again, but it is great to connect with everybody this morning. Thanks for making the time.
When you do come to Indy, make sure we get to see you down in Columbus. We'd love to have you see our city and meet you in person. So
absolutely.
Absolutely. It's great to see you again.
You too. Congrats on everything.
Thanks.
Thanks for all of you who've joined us today. And remember, next week we'll be back, and we'll be with Mike King and Brian Rushton talking about Google LHP Analytics. So thank you all. Have a great day and a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Bye.